All right. Well, thank you everyone who is here. This is kind of a small get together we have every Wednesday. The Net Kids Film Club is an Indigenous centered film community dedicated to and promoting filmmaking and exposing film scholarship as career trajectories for young Indigenous adults. Um, my name is Chris. I'm the quote unquote founder and director of the Net Kids Film Club. And the program that we wanted to start is to highlight the horror genre as a vessel for creativity and accessing Indigenous languages and cultural expressions, all while deconstructing colonial storytelling. And the Language of Horror series specifically has been actually a weekly informal meeting with artists and creatives throughout the month of October, whose works are in conversation with the horror genre. So we'll be discussing what an artistic career looks like and what inspires these journeys. We also want to acknowledge the 23 Native nations that inhabit this land we are currently located on the ancestral territories of Indigenous people, including Aka, Amel, and Peepash Indian communities. And again, just wanted to thank everybody for coming in. People will come shuffling in and out. We ask that you keep your videos and your audio muted. Um, the structure of tonight's kind of conversation will be the first 10 minutes. We'll have our guests read from any selected work that they want to present for the first 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes. And then we'll have a conversation regarding their career as a writer, how the language of horror has inspired their work. And in the last 15 to 10 minutes, we'll take questions from people who are in the room to kind of ask additional questions that they're curious about, especially when it comes to how the language of horror has influenced our guest's career. And tonight we got Ryan C. Bradley, who is a musician,
Hey,
podcaster.
everybody. Sorry,
uh,
go ahead. Go ahead. I didn't mean to
oh,
interrupt.
you good. Is a musician, podcaster, and author of the novella Saint's Blood, Bad Connection, Horror Stories, Dumb Bullshit for Brilliant Idiots, and the forthcoming Say Uncle. His short fiction has appeared in No Sleep, Tales to Terrify, and Dark Moon Digest, among others. He hosts the Horror Anthology podcast on his Patreon and co-hosts Horror Hangover with Cass Clark. And you can learn more about him at ryancbradley.com. All right, here we have Ryan.
Hey, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for having me, Chris. I'm just reading my story, Death Isn't Far today. This is the one that was published in No Sleep, Suddenly Shocking, Volume 18. Death Isn't Far. We'd finally gotten the baby to sleep through the night. Then Mom moved in with us. An infection in her foot had turned gangrenous and traveled up to her heart, so there were no other options. I never liked her dog, Charlie. The Pomeranian curled up in a ball next to her chest all day, then barked at the door all night. Stay off camera, sweetheart. We thought something had to be out there, so we bought a smart doorbell with a camera. The kids loved yelling to each other through my phone that first day. Matilda, our oldest girl, sent her younger siblings outside and made them guess the password, always a variant of pee pee or poo poo to be let back in. They played all day while Travis was at work and I was typing away, trying not to look half dead from sleep deprivation and video meetings. That night, my phone buzzed before Charlie started barking. Something had set off the motion detector on the doorbell camera. Travis? I asked. A breeze would wake me, but it took a hurricane to rouse him. He didn't stir. I brought my phone as close as it could get while it charged and opened the app. I was expecting trash blowing in the wind, a car driving past, or teenagers walking by with a joint. Instead, there was a dark figure, tall, sepulchral, wearing a black robe. It reached its hand out for the door. Charlie went ballistic, barking off camera. The hand pulled back. The figure waited there. I watched, fascinated. The two were at a stalemate. Charlie couldn't drive the figure away, and it couldn't get past Charlie. The day's thousands exhaustions got to me, and I fell into a half sleep for the rest of the night. I didn't wake Travis or show him the video in the morning because he'd hid the 38 special he'd agreed to get rid of in a shoebox in the closet. Him stepping out like John Wayne and blasting whatever that thing was wouldn't do anything to solve our problems. There'd still be four kids running around. My mother would still be dying. Charlie would probably bark more, and my husband would be in jail. That morning, the kids were wild, running across the house. Matilda took the phone from my hand and ordered all her siblings outside the door now. It was summer, and I surrendered. Mom needed her oatmeals anyway. Between spoonfuls, I asked, "How are you feeling today?" "I can't sleep, dear," she said. "Charlie barking?" I asked. Charlie perked up at the sound of his name, but then nuzzled back into Mom when he saw the food wasn't for him. "There's that, but there's something else too," she said. I didn't have the heart to tell her about the figure stalking our door. The meat had gone from her bones, leaving a skeleton, and she couldn't stand. She was the woman who raised me, but diminished. "I think we both know that death isn't far," she said. I put down the bowl of oatmeal on the side table next to her bed. I nodded. "Yes, Mom." Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't wipe them away. "Will you take good care of Charlie?" she asked. "Of course," I said. "Good, good. I think I've eaten enough." She'd only taken one bite, but I didn't argue. I didn't bother to go to bed that night, waiting up until the figure appeared. Charlie was waiting for me by the front door. He turned toward me for a second, as if to acknowledge we were there for the same thing. I made him sit, and then I stepped out into the night. The figure had to duck to avoid the porch light. The parts outside of its robe were hairless. The skin on its face was pinched like it was being pulled back by clothespins. Its pupils were black holes swallowing universes of life. "You're here for her?" I asked. The thing looked down at me. It took a second to consider, then nodded. "She was a good mother," I said. Inside, Charlie growled. The sound swelled into a single staccato bark. Sorry, my kid just almost kicked over the stand my computer's on. A cool breeze swept across the neighborhood, and I hugged myself for warmth. "I broker, no deals," the figure said. Its voice was creaky, like it hadn't spoken in a very long time. "Before I had my own kid, I thought she was a screw up," I said. Like everyone does. She had six, but I'm barely handling four." The figure assessed me, its empty, absorbing eyes sending a chill when they met mine. "But you can't get past the dog," I said, which seemed odd. An 8-pound dog holding off an 8-foot tall celestial thing. "It is not Charlie's time," the figure said. "What'll happen if the dog keeps you out for the next 5 years?" I asked. I wanted the time with my mother, but I'd heard her groaning. I'd seen her embarrassed as I'd emptied her bedpan. The figure turned its head sideways. "I broker, no deals," it said more forcefully. "But you can't get past the dog," I said. As if on cue, Charlie let out a torrent of barks. "There is a gun. There could be an accident," the thing said. It didn't mention Matilda, but I pictured her in her cowboy outfit, pretending to ride a horse into the closet. I imagined her getting the shoebox down. I opened the door and picked Charlie up. He wriggled as I led the figure through the house. I put Charlie on the bed, and he seemed to realize there was no stopping what came next. He nuzzled against Mom, and I held her hand as she passed. The spirit that came out of her was young, from a time before she'd had me. She smiled at me and took the thing's hand. Death didn't need to tell me the gift it was giving. The end.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Um, I believe that's on No Sleep Podcast, correct?
Yes, suddenly shocking number 18. It's behind their Patreon paywall.
Awesome. And that's podcast series that's ongoing, right?
Yeah, yeah, they're great. I'm so psyched to have a story in there. I've been listening to them since grad school.
Mhm.
I finished grad school in 2016, I want to say. So that took like 10 years of trying, but I am
Yeah.
psyched to have a story in there finally.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. I've only listened to a couple here and there, but I haven't run across yours and I've been meaning to find it. But you do have a kind of work kind of interlapping into each other. You have work in writing, creative writing, and then you have
Yeah.
podcasting, right? And so you have
Yes.
everything kind of lacing together and braiding into each other. And I guess that kind of leads me to my first question for you. How has the language of horror influenced you in your career?
In a lot of ways. I have anxiety, like real bad anxiety, diagnosed by a therapist. So like horror always feels like home to me because
Hmm.
I'm always scared of everything. I think you've probably seen me faint to stop my kid's leg from hitting this tray table probably 7 or 8 times, and she's probably not actually going to hit it. I'm just jumpy,
Hmm.
And in a horror story, the tray table gets knocked down, and
Hmm.
that's like what feels natural to me as a person.
Hmm.
So that's like a huge influence and just the way it just feels like the way I see the world is coming out on paper or on film when I'm reading or watching or writing horror,
Hmm.
as opposed to other genres.
Yeah, definitely. I know we went back and forth between emails, and one of the things that I've always expressed to you and the other people that are part of this series is um language for me, I believe, is a future language, meaning it speaks towards things that we have yet to articulate. And this, I mean, you're talking about it right here. You're talking about a thing that has yet to happen.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and that kind of speaks to what does that mean? What does that mean to talk about the future in a way that in the way that we can. And the horror genre kind of does this, especially when it comes to very heavy topics, and it finds very unique ways to talk about that. And in that way, why are we not speaking towards these things with more generosity and care?
Hmm.
But we're speaking with them with such grotesque and such horrific imagery and language, right? That's the
Yeah.
language of horror. Um, and why do we barricade these kinds of topics, really, right? And if we were to speak towards them, could we have saved, rescued, changed a life? You think about these when
Yeah.
kind of look at these stories. And this is what I refer to when I mean the language of horror. And the thing that you said there was kind of an example of that. It's speaking towards the future. But it could mean many different things to many different people, and that's the magic of the horror genre, is it could be malleable. The meaning of it changes a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and what is your relationship to horror now?
I'm a huge, like, obviously I'm a horror writer. I'm a big horror fan. I'll give you the whole thing. So I started reading like horror, like Stephen King when I was probably 8 or 9. I started with Firestarter, which I've since been told is his most sexual book.
Yeah.
But as a 9-year-old, that was like one of my first chapter books. I didn't pick up on any of that. But I remember like the dad, like very distinctly, like he'd use his powers and then get a headache. And I loved that as a kid. I was always too scared to watch horror movies growing up, though. Because I
Mhm.
watched, I think, like, remember Signs, the M. Night Shyamalan flick from like 2002, I think.
Yeah.
I watched that when I was 12, and I was like scared of those aliens for weeks afterwards. But it was like a double-sided sword because I remember we went on the eighth grade field trip to Washington, D.C., and Signs came on the bus, and I grabbed another kid's leg during the scene where you see the leg in the cornfield, and he jumped like almost out of the bus. And that was like so much fun. I think it was fun for him too, the way we reacted afterwards. Not fun in the moment, but like horror gives you that like freedom. And so I got really into it when I was 18, though, the movie specifically, and like because I realized like I'd always kind of liked it, and I just applied to music school, and it was this like long, arduous process, and I was practicing jazz for like 3 hours a day, even though I'm more of a rock guitarist
Hmm.
because there was no schools outside of like one in LA, and at that time that would teach you rock guitar as like a collegiate class. So I just like dedicated myself entirely to learning jazz guitar, playing 3, 4 hours a day, music I didn't even particularly like. And then I got rejected from jazz school. Like after that, I was like crushed because I was 18. When you're 18, it seems like a gatekeeper says no to you once, and you're like, this is it. I'll never be a musician because you're 18. You just don't know, you know? Um, but I decided that that meant I had to be a writer, and I thought about where I liked reading, and I thought the fire starter. And so I started writing horror, and I went to college, and I was between creative writing and psychology. And I took some classes in both, and I was like, all right, I'm doing creative writing, but I had to do literary fiction,
Hmm.
which I actually have like some affection for still. It's probably not my favorite thing in the world, but I learned how to write literary fiction for 4 years, and I got rejected from every MFA program I applied to, just straight across the board, all rejections. And it felt like a repeat of being 18, but
Hmm.
I was more of an adult then. And I was like, all right, I like this. I'm going to stick with it. And I started writing horror then, and I applied to MFA programs again. And in between, I did an interview with Steve Almond and Billy Giraldi, and
Yeah,
that got in the Missouri Review. And once I had a publication in the Missouri Review, I got a big scholarship to an MFA program, which was
nice.
great. But then I was back into literary fiction. And so I wrote more literary fiction for like, it was a 3 year program for 2.5 years. And I finished my thesis a semester early. And I realized like, I don't like this. And I'm not going to spend my life like writing a type of fiction I don't particularly like.
Hmm.
So I got the Time Out London's top 100 horror movies and I just shotgunned them.
Hmm.
Like 2 months, 100 movies. I just watched every single one that I hadn't seen already. Started reading every horror book I could find. And that was like 2016. So it's been 8 years and I'm still kind of just trying to shotgun as much horror as I can into my brain.
Hmm.
So I'm aware of the genre I'm writing in. I'm aware of the tropes. I'm aware of what's been done and kind of what hasn't been done. I'm trying to read theory work too and just kind of be on top of everything. And like when I was grinding for like the jazz, like I mentioned, when I was a high school student, like I hated that. I don't hate this at all. Like I read a horror novel, I'm excited, I'm into it. It doesn't feel like grinding at all. So I know
Yeah.
people talk a lot about like the grind set now and like how the grind set is bad, and I think that's true. But I think the trick is like if you listen to like Ray Bradbury, for example, who I know has his problems, but when you listen to him talk about fiction or you like read his essays about fiction, there was never anything else he wanted to be doing. Like when he was eating, he was like, shit, I should be reading a book right now. He wasn't like, this steak tastes good. He was like, I wish I was reading a sci-fi novel. I just
Yeah.
try to bring that energy into horror.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah, that's exactly, I think a lot of the times people don't think they think it's just point A to point B to find the thing that you're looking for. And that's the success story people kind of look for within their own writing. One of the things that kind of came to mind when you were speaking was Robin Wood's on horror film. I don't know if you've heard of it, but
Have it.
he's a critic who wrote a
Yeah.
collection of essays and reviews, and there's a section on it. I think it's called like the Introduction to American Horror, and it's just super. It's one of the first real essays and theoretical writings that kind of very really venture into what horror is doing for American cinema. And I think that's kind of
Hmm.
interesting that you were talking about that because it's a part of writing. You need to know the theory of it. What theory really at its core means future again.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and so that's kind of funny that we want to talk about a future language and what does the future of it look like and why are we speaking, why are we even using it is a good question to have, I think. Um, and when you went into your MFA, was there anything that felt like I could maybe work this to my advantage? Or was it kind of like this isn't really my vibe or my whole thing? Like what was that like?
Great question. There are some writers like Karen Russell, Jim Shepard, Louise Erdrich, who are like, they're just incredible. And I would say like writing at a certain point just kind of transcends genre.
Mhm.
Where like if you were doing it at a high enough level, I think anyone can enjoy it.
Yeah.
So there's stuff like that, but like every craft trick I learned, I still use. Like every I mean, probably the most important thing is like just writing concisely, at least in my mind.
Yeah.
And so like we practiced that a ton. We talked about characterization, and then like the reading classes. We had this great literature class where we just you ever heard of inserts?
Hmm.
So we
Yeah.
did inserts, and for those of you who may not have heard of them in the audience, I know my mom has not. Love you, mom. But it's like you read like a Hemingway story, for example, and then you write a passage in Hemingway's style and you try to sneak it into the story.
Yeah.
And you're like really just trying to write like that writer. And I feel like learning to do that kind of analysis is so useful across any genre because you can now take any master and you can do that work on them.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's something that a professor at my MFA kind of was talking about. We didn't practice it, but
Yeah.
it's something that she was really advocating for. And I was kind of thinking to myself, well, I can see some great qualities to it, but I can also see it's not so great qualities to it. It's just one of those
Yeah.
things. It's like, okay, I can take bits and pieces of it. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't really do or don't really kind of when they're kind of walking into a space, they kind of think, oh, I'm going to listen, and then they don't like what they hear. I'm just gonna check out, but there's bits and pieces that you can still certainly take from the conversation. And I think that's what's important.
Yeah.
In terms of, I know we're talking kind of like in that section of horror in terms of writing, but I'm kind of curious to see how you moved into the space of podcasting and how that kind of relates.
Yeah. So when I was living in Tulsa, I was in a writing group,
Hmm.
and my friends have a podcast called Beyond the Cabin in the Woods.
Hmm.
And they invited me to come on. I think the first movie we talked about was, I think it was the Twilight Zone movie, um, which has its big issues. A bunch of people on set got killed because of irresponsible use of a helicopter, which was absolutely tragic. But they invited me on, and I went on, and I was like, this is basically a graduate school class where you watch something and talk about it, and you get recorded. And at the end, like other people listen to it. Like, I could do that. I could do that all day. I liked the literature classes, like I was saying. And so I went on there a couple of times. I don't think I'd have ever started my own until my friend Cass, my co-host Cass Clark, messaged me. They had got me a job at CBR, and we both worked there for a little while. CBR was not good, and I quit that after about 3 months. Um, I might have an NDA. I might not be allowed to say that, so nobody repeat that. But yeah, Cass invited me to do a podcast, and I was like, yeah, I love talking to Cass. I'll do it. And we've
Hmm.
been doing it for 3 years now. I think we're about to hit 3 years.
Hmm. Is there anything that you're kind of seeing that you were practicing in creative writing that you're using in podcasting now?
I should say the name of the show is Horror Hangover. I don't think I mentioned that
Yeah.
earlier.
Yes.
And I should
Yep.
definitely say the name of the show I'm hosting. Uh, I would say not the writing per se, but the workshop skills that you're doing. You're in a conversation with my MFA program was 12 people per class, and you talk to those people for 3.5 hours about two short stories.
Mm.
So like that skill of talking about story, I think is what translates more than like the writing itself. Because
Yeah.
Horror Hangover, we were focused on film specifically, and I don't have a film background.
Hmm.
So like I'm not trying to necessarily apply like craft. I think the craft of a film is very different. When you're a writer, you are one person on an island. Sometimes you have two or three collaborators for a book. But when you're on a film, you're like a Marvel film, there's like 1,000 people working on that thing. That's like a whole industry.
Yeah.
And for smaller films, even you'd have like 30 to 100 people.
Yeah.
Okay, don't look this. Okay,
Yeah.
what do you want to do? Sorry, one second,
Definitely.
y'all. What can I help you? You
Yeah.
want to go
And I
back to
think
the videos? Okay, what did you want? You want Baby Finn? Yeah. Okay. You can't watch it over here. You have to stay off camera, okay? Sorry about that, y'all. We had a babysitter and she fell through. The second babysitter texted me something very gross this morning. and my partner's working, so we are
We're
sitting.
double.
Please stay upstairs. So sorry about that, y'all. You had a question, Chris. I'm sorry.
No, no, you're good, kid. Yeah, that's so interesting. I think that's not what you would think you would be bringing to another medium. Um, it's just so interesting how much you could do with, especially with an MFA. I think there's so many practices of it that you can take into other forms, other genres. Um, with this being kind of like more of a, I guess, a contextual reading of films, do you find that that the themes in literature and the themes and film are kind of resonating equally, or is there some difference between the two that you're kind of noticing?
So I wrote film reviews for a while for Wicked Horror.
Hmm.
And if you go back and read my early reviews, I was terrible. I don't think I ever really got good at film criticism, which is why I don't do it anymore.
Hmm.
But the thing I always missed was that I was watching a film as a script and then writing about it as a script. So
Yeah,
as I get more and more, um, I don't want to say better, sophisticated in my ability to view films, I'm starting to see like, oh, the acting is really important too, and there's resonance in that, and like the visual symbols matter a lot.
yeah,
When I first started film critique, I didn't see any of that. I was just so keen and honed in on the writing that I was totally missing it. It's like I hope I'm getting better at that.
I know that's like so funny because it's I actually came from a film background and then going
Hmm.
into poetry, and now like kind of doing that reverse lens look back on film. I'm seeing a lot of working of an image and a poem. Um, it's the same way that you would analyze a film, and especially when you're looking at frame, specific frame.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and so you're really thinking about, well, okay, well, what is this image doing for the audience, and how is it serving the story? And you think about that when you're looking at poetry as well. It's like, how is this image working on its own? And how is it working as a part of the poem? What is it working towards? What kind of pressure is it putting
Hmm.
on the language of what you're trying to say? Especially with poetry, you're testing language consistently. And so in horror, it's almost like you're doing the same thing, but with images. And I think that's interesting that you
Yeah.
say that too, is like it's all universal. Everything can be used in tandem with each other.
I love
Do you
that idea
think?
of pressure. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I was
Oh
just saying
no.
I love your idea about pressure. I've not heard poetry described as like pressure testing language. That's very cool.
Yeah, we our workshops can go on for 4 to 5 hours. It's crazy. It's just
Yeah.
the poem is ridiculous. And it leads to great discussion and discourse too. I think
Yeah.
that's what writing does, I think. And specifically with horror, where do you see horror now moving towards in terms of scholarship, in terms of criticism? Where do you see it moving from here?
Are you asking me where I see horror as a genre moving, where I see critiques of horror moving?
Critiques, sorry, critiques of horror.
I don't think I'm up enough on that to know, unfortunately. I'm not th I read a couple of like horror analysis books a year, but I'm definitely not up on like the latest research.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of that. About fiction, I could say like the really cool thing happening in fiction right now, horror fiction specifically, is that it's opened to a more diverse group of creators than ever before. It's like in the 80s, there was a boom, and it was like Peter Straub, who's great, Stephen King, who's great, and all of these other guys around that, and they were all white dudes. There might have been like a white woman like Anne Rice in there once in a while. But now the movement is like Johnny Compton is a black man. He's phenomenal. Stephen Graham Jones is excellent. So it's like this new Haley Piper, this new Victor LaValle, new group of very diverse voices that are absolutely doing incredible work in horror. And the genre is booming because of that more than
Hmm.
anything else. And it's very cool. And I'm very excited about it.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting. I like that. It does come from that place of what does the authenticity of the horror look like, and how can it how can it influence more from there? And I think you speak of a lot of those writers are BIPOC writers, which is really cool.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
what are they introducing to the horror genre that we have not explored yet? And that's the question right there. Like,
yeah,
what are we doing? How are we going to analyze this new way, this new horror? A couple of years ago, 20 years ago, actually, new genre in film was and quote unquote invented the elevated horror, which is now the A24
yeah,
standard, right? With,
yeah,
with the Babadook. And so once that came into play, it almost kind of introduced this new way of reinventing what the horror genre is doing and kind of giving new images to the genre. Um, are there any current reads or watches that are kind of inspiring you right now with in terms of all of this new movement?
yeah. I love One Cut of the Dead. I know I emailed you a list and I forgot what was
Yeah.
on the list I emailed you. One Cut of the Dead, if you haven't seen it, is phenomenal. I don't want to spoil it, but the credits roll like 35 minutes in, and the good part of the movie is after that.
Yeah.
It's just, have you seen it?
No, not yet.
No, okay. Yeah, One Cut of the Dead is absolutely incredible. So I'm
Mhm.
very excited about that. In terms of the BIPOC we were talking about earlier, Victor Laval has this book. I used to teach it when I was teaching comp classes, The Ballad of Black Tom.
Mhm.
And he took H.P. Lovecraft's story, The Horror at Red Hook, I think is the original, H.P. Lovecraft's most racist story.
Mhm.
And Victor Laval is a black man. He wrote it from the point of view of like a black character H.P. Lovecraft kind of mentions once.
Yeah.
And he just totally turns the whole thing on its head. And
Mhm.
it's scarier than the Lovecraft and it's better written. And it just like, it makes me excited that this is happening in the genre I work in too.
Mhm.
Um, Let me take a look at that list I sent you the other day.
I actually have your list up here.
Oh, yeah.
But one film that I actually want to really highlight on
Yeah.
your list, which is actually not, it's horror adjacent. It's The Shape of Water,
Oh, yeah.
which
Yeah.
I think is extremely interesting to kind of see and list as a horror film. Only because at its core, it really is about interracial, intercultural love. And that, what does that
Yeah.
look like, right? And it's so interesting. Again, it goes back to the idea of language of horror. What is the language of the future? With the horror as the language of the future, what is it talking about that we are not talking about right now? Interracial love, intercultural love. And The Shape of Water is really doing that. When did this come out? 2017, a couple years ago, right?
Uh, yeah, I was living in Tulsa because I saw it in a theater in Tulsa. So somewhere between 2017 and 2020.
Yeah, and it's been a couple of years since it came out, and so to talk about interracial love, and I think another film came out sometime around that time period called Loving, which was
Yeah.
about racial love, which didn't go on to win too many awards. It wasn't, lauded as much. It was just one performance that everybody was talking about, but Shape of Water was the thing that what everyone was talking about at the time. um, which I think is again really interesting, and it's horror adjacent. It's not really technically
Yeah.
right. Um,
I mean, I would argue it's horror, but I don't think that's the
no,
interesting part of this conversation.
go
I
for
think
it.
the
Go for
interesting
it.
thing is like Michael Shannon being his character. If y'all haven't seen it, he's this like he's basically the muscle of this facility where they're
Yeah,
holding what's basically the creature from the Black Lagoon, and one of the what's her job? Custodian.
I think so. Yeah.
She's a custodian. She falls in love with the creature, and it's this beautiful romance. And Michael Shannon gets his fingers cut off, and so the whole time he gets them sewed back on. But the whole movie, you see this like rotting infection in his heart, and it's this like great symbol. I mean, you see this rotting infection on his fingers, but it's the symbol for the rotting infection in his heart. The hatred that he has for them is destroying him, and it's so beautifully rendered. It's very horrific, though, in the way the scene where he loses the fingers, someone's power washing under a chest of drawer
Yeah.
tool. and the fingers just wash back out and they sew them back on. Um, but I think it's yeah, I think it's a great film. I think it's very interesting when you contrast it with Loving, because I think horror has always had, because we've mentioned this a few times before, this ability to make you think about the things people don't want to think about. Because I think Loving is probably an excellent film, but also when I hear that like they made a movie about that family, I personally like I want to watch it on like a level of like this will make me a better person and
Yeah.
I want to see it. But in terms of like it's Friday night, we get to watch one movie this week and I'm drinking a beer, it's probably not the movie I'm going to pick, but The Shape of Water, I
Mhm.
would pick that, you know, because it's
Yeah.
got this Trojan horse. We're seeing a woman and a monster fall in love. And that's like that Trojan horse of like, now we can talk about anything because we added a monster. And like, I would watch basically any movie with a monster in it. You give me tentacles, scales, big teeth, like, yeah, I want to see that.
Love it. Yeah, that's I really think it is, again, it's talking about things that we don't want to talk about. And then that's a visual element of it. Again, that's a piece of poetry right there. It's giving I know this writer that I met at Tin House, and she does this funny thing, and I laugh at it all the time. It's on Instagram, and she says, "Is it poetry or is it business?" And she always does compare and contrast, and it's just so hilarious. She does this is how she's doing her readings in Philadelphia, and I think it's just the most brilliant thing ever. But it really is showing people like how poetry is kind of we woven into everything we do, and that image of the monster is poetry right there.
Oh, yeah,
The
absolutely.
image of the fingers getting cut off, that's poetry right there,
Yeah.
right? um the movie going on to win I don't know how many freaking Oscars, that's business right there, right? And
Yeah.
so, and
Yeah. Yeah.
it's just it's all in tandem. The poetry is supporting the business of it. Or do you have, I know we're kind of like 6-9 right now. We're gonna go into kind of like questions here in the next 10 minutes. Is there any other films right now that are, or actually reads that are you would can that are inspiring kind of your work in podcasting or in writing right now?
Uh, House of Leaves, I think about a lot. I'll give everybody like the Cliff Notes version.
I opened it and I got scared and I was like, I will read this when I.
Yeah, it's about 1,000 pages. It's gigantic too. It's bigger than my head. It's like gigantic, bigger than my head, 1,000 pages. But the frame story is this guy moves into an apartment and he finds this set of notebooks that the old person who lived in the apartment lived, the old tenant, and the old guy was blind, but he watched this set of films. And so the journals, which are basically the book, are blind man's what's the word? Transcription of these films. And the film is about a family who's living in this house and they measure the outside and the inside and they find like it's like 6 inches or a foot different from the outside to the inside. And they start exploring what is that extra space. And it gets very scary at a couple points. It's a very scary book. It's very metatextual and it's very
It's poetry.
very yeah. It's also like it makes a lot of cool uses of the graphic design. Like there's a scene with a labyrinth where the book turns into a labyrinth. So
Mhm.
the pages don't line up anymore, and you have to like go to page 79, then come back to page 54, and it just keeps going like that for a couple minutes.
Mhm. Yeah,
Actually, we're not. Don't touch that. Don't touch that. Sorry. You touch whatever you want, Chris. You're an adult.
I yeah, been wanting to read it for a while. I just haven't really gotten around to it. It's one of those big books. It's like it's gonna take a lot of brain power to get through this. And
It
again,
is a big brain power book.
it is it I would argue it's poetry. The way the whole thing is written, it's written like Layli Long Soldier's whereas I think that's the closest thing I could compare it to, which is she's a poet, Lakota poet, and the entire collection of Whereas is geared towards the conversation of what had happened when Lincoln made the speech for slave emancipation. I'm kind of losing my words right now, but at the same time, he hanged 38 Lakota men. And so she's
Oh,
redirecting
shit.
that conversation with her collection and kind of discussing what does that look like and why are we using such legal jargon around this. I think she's working on something new, which is kind of in the same vein, but it's really interesting how House of Leaves is doing the same thing on the page that Laylee is doing on the page as well. Um, Again, it's poetry. It's business and it's poetry, right?
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that's something I think it's sharing these genres are really kind of crossing each other and meeting each other.
Oh, baby fish,
Um, Last question for you before we go and
baby fish.
give you their or have questions for you. Do you
I
have any advice for anyone who wants to pursue
love
podcasting or writing?
Yeah. Just the world is going to knock you down a bunch. It's hard. You have to be patient. You have to be persistent. And like more than anything, like love the thing you're doing. Because if you love the work you're doing, it doesn't matter if anyone else is listening. It doesn't matter if anyone's paying you for it, because the reward is the work.
Mhm.
And the reward should be the work. And if you figure out how to emotionally metabolize that, please let me know how.
Great
But
advice.
yeah.
Love it. All right, we are at hitting the 15-minute mark. If anyone would like to have any questions, the floor is open. People will get a little bit shy for like the first 2 minutes, and then the
Will
questions just
people will they also be asking on Instagram Live?
no, not there, no. Oh, we have a question here. What is your advice for aspiring writers that have a difficult time focusing on conveying a story?
Uh, so I think the important thing, ass in the chair. So I think if you keep working at it, you'll get it. But the important thing is that you keep going. And like when I say ass in the chair, I mean like right, or at least at first. I mean, honor your process, of course. And
Mhm.
whatever your process is, that's what you need to do. But I think if you're struggling, sitting in the chair until you're done can be very helpful, at least for like the first time. And then like after that, take breaks as necessary. I mean, don't feel like you need to finish everything you start. I know Neil Gaiman, who's obviously in hot water for the allegations against him, always says like finish whatever you start. I'm not allowed to swear on this, so screw that guy. um, but yeah, honor your process and like give yourself time to work and take off the pressure. There is no pressure. If you're enjoying the time writing, it doesn't matter if you ever finish or not.
Awesome. Nice, nice. Anyone else have any questions? Got it. Ass in the chair, hands on the keyboard. Give yourself time to work. Take breaks. It's short and simple. Anyone else? All right. Lighthearted question. How do you pick names of characters and any ones you're especially proud of?
I just shoot from the hip for character names. I know there's like a tradition where like Charles Dickens named that woman in Great Expectations Miss Havisham, and it's because she's a sham, and like I don't do that. I do the opposite. I and like I'm really bad at remembering people's names in real life.
Hmm.
So like the most interesting thing I do with names is when I make a name, I make a list of names as soon as I start a new long project, and I just start writing everyone's name down as I go, so I don't change the name multiple times throughout a project.
Love it. Awesome. Anyone else? Oh, we have one. Hold on 1 second. I don't want to miss anyone. What does your day-to-day look like in terms of a writing routine? Any advice for balancing writing with other responsibilities?
So, great question. You probably noticed my toddler coming onto screen a couple of times throughout this. So obviously, like my toddler, Sydney, is my main responsibility in this world. I'm a stay-at-home dad most of the time. She has daycare from 7 to 12. So that's my writing time, and my running time. I'm training for a marathon, which I cannot stop talking about. But I think the important thing when you have to balance with other responsibilities is just giving yourself grace and forgiveness on the days that you don't get it. Because like for me, like my toddler is more important than my writing. I would like it to be the other way. Maybe I wouldn't like it the other way, but like I like writing a lot and like I would love to get the time I was getting in pre-kid. Um, but I can't. And if I'm angry at myself for not having written yesterday, I'm not going to write today. So the
Mhm.
important thing is like, I mean, I guess Monday morning quarterback, you don't remember what happened on Sunday. You write when you can, and you give yourself like the grace and the space to create at the speed that you need to create based on what's happening in your life now.
Mhm. Nice. Good advice. Awesome. Anyone else have any good questions? Anyone? Maybe some craft questions or maybe horror-centered questions? I know Ryan's doing a lot of analyzation with film, so it'd be interesting to hear what his thoughts are on some horror genre specifics or even just craft writing. Let's see. Awesome. We have one here. Favorite black and white horror film?
Oh, that's tough. I'm trying to remember the name of the movie. You would like it a lot. It's like very poetic. There's a preacher. He's not a preacher. The guy who looks like a preacher, and he's got love and hate tattooed on his
Night of the
knuckles.
Hunter?
Yes, Night of the Hunter. Night of the Hunter is phenomenal. It's such a beautiful film.
Yeah.
I'm very bad at picking favorites. If you ask me again, I'll probably have a different answer. But Night
Mhm.
of the Hunter is like a movie you can't go wrong with.
Yeah. I would say anything pre-code. Pre-code Hollywood is before the industry was well, it was also adopted. It, it occurred between, I forget what it was. It's like really hard to narrow down for me. Sometime
Yeah.
around sound, sound was invented, and censorship was kind of a little weary. There was really no censorship,
Yeah.
and so horror really kind of was like doing a lot at that time period. And there was actually a lot of films that were written and directed by women of color.
Hmm.
Men, especially the Black community, were doing a lot during this time, but because film was made with not the materials that film was made with was so flammable, Hollywood studios were just chugging these things out like year after year, day after day, that there was so much film they would just throw it out once they're done
Ooh.
showing it. So there's a lot of lost films that we don't have from the pre-code era and more and on and beyond that. And so I think this pre-code era is really interesting to see what they were able to get away with. There was a lot of nudity, there was a lot of language, there was a lot of grotesque imagery. So, and there was a lot of, again, language that was going on in those films that they were not talking about at that time. So I think that's really interesting to talk about. Criterion Channel has quite a few pre-code films. I know this is not a pre-code, but one of my absolute black and white favorites is Cat People. Um,
Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah, I just love that film so much. It's incredible. I think it's the grandmother of Jennifer's Body and Ginger
Hmm.
Snaps. So that's all. I have a long-winded answer. All right, we have one more.
I loved Skinamarink.
Yeah.
And Tiffany, who was on this series earlier, and I had a table at Ghoulish together 2 years ago, and I had the Skinamarink phone because we just had it for my kid. And I had it on my table so people would come over and talk to me about Skinamarink. And
Mhm.
Tiffany hated it, and her husband saw it, and he couldn't watch more than like 15 minutes. And what he said, and I think this is true, is that like if you had moments in your childhood where you're like you were worried your parents weren't going to come home and you were like wandering around grandma's house while your parents were at a wedding or something, Skinamarink was gonna like hit you like a freight train. And if you did not have that feeling as a child, Skinamarink was gonna be an hour and a half of just like looking at three quarters of a wall.
That is a great description. I haven't seen it yet, so it's one of those films. It's like, should I watch it? Should I watch it? Because it's that thing of like people are getting walking away with completely different
Yeah.
impressions of it, and it's so hard to say, okay, I trust you, but then I trust you, and then like
I mean, I
it's
think that one's like going to be so subjective. You should watch it and just see what you think. I think it is like in a lot of ways very poetic. So
Mhm.
you might like it, but you might hate it because like the critique that it's 90 minutes of staring at walls with basically no dialogue is accurate. There's no taking away from that. Whether that makes you feel something or not is a totally different ball game. But yeah, it's 90 minutes of staring at a wall.
Oh my God. I have one question for you actually. It's just my own personal thing is because you're doing podcasting, I think that's one of the things that I gravitated towards wanting to ask you to be on here was just the idea that you were doing all these different things, but they're all kind of overlapping. And I think we said it at the beginning, or was it off camera, but they're all kind of working together. And I think that's one of the most amazing things you could do as an artist is have to work in all these different genres and all these different forms and mediums, and they're all having conversations with each other. So with podcasting, how do you, and I guess this is more of like me on my own like personal journey and the edit journey, the post-production journey. How are you finding story when you're done with the podcast, it's done, the conversation's over. Do you just put it out there as is, or do you actually go through and find a story within the edit? How does that part, how do you go through that?
Great question. I do not. So when I'm editing a podcast, I'm not moving stuff around. I'm letting the conversation flow as it did, but I'm
Mhm.
trying to make it more stylized. It's like I'm cutting out the ums, I'm cutting out breaths, I'm cutting out like if someone has a long diatribe, I'll try to cut that down. Or someone, the thing where people say like, "Oh, what's the word I mean?"
Yeah.
And then like I'll cut that out completely, unless like someone else answers it, and then I'll shorten the pause gaps. And I'm really trying to take like so we record an episode and it's like 2.5 hours long. My goal is to get that below 2 hours
Mhm.
more than anything else when I'm doing the editing process. Because like as a podcast listener, when I see something is more than an hour long, I'm like, when am I going to do this?
Yeah.
I mean, other than like marathon training, there's no time when I have like more than 2 hours at once where I'm doing one thing that I can
Uh,
just dedicate my energy to something like that.
yeah. Exactly. That's how I kind of think as well as like it's this thing that again I bring her up again, but lately Long Soldier brought this idea up, and I think somebody in the room kind of knows what this is, but she has this marriage of content, what the thing is about and what it means. And then there's the form. What is it resting on? Is it a film? Is it a screenplay? And if you want to get dig even deeper, is it a couplet? Is it a quatrain? These are poetic terms, but these are different things. Like
Yeah.
how is the content and the form serving each other on a, and they're both wheels on a bicycle, right? And so that's why I ask you is that when you're going through the editing process, you're thinking about how is the content informing the form of this thing that I'm doing,
Yeah.
right? And so, that's where I was kind of wondering if that's where you're thinking. It sounds like that's kind of what you're doing, right?
I think so. Yeah, yeah. I'm trying to get the content to better fit the form,
hmm
I guess would be the easiest way to put it.
Yeah, because you're thinking about again, you took a step back and said, "What is this? Who's this podcast serving? It's an
Yeah.
hour, over an hour. Can I do this? Is it doable? Like,
Yeah,
it's one
yeah.
of those things. It's a question of who is it ultimately serving, and what is it? What's the purpose of it? And how do you want it to work in the world? Is kind of the question. Yeah, thank you. I think we're hitting 6:30. If anybody else has any other questions, yay, nay, maybe no. Give it maybe another 30 seconds.
Well, in the meantime, thank you so much for having me, Chris. This was a great time.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. This is super, super needed. The conversation is largely about careers and largely about how one simple thing like horror has created this big, huge, I wouldn't say like a massive, massive career, but it creates a good career, right? It creates your interest in other fields and it branches into other mediums and you start to dabble and find your way as an artist. And I think that's what's important. And especially when you're thinking about growing beyond that and thinking, okay, who else am I serving? Am I serving a community or am I serving myself? So I like to have those conversations. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everybody who tuned in tonight. I hope you all enjoyed it.
Yes. Again, this is our website is under construction because we want to put these videos on there. So they'll be saved down eventually, just not in the near future. But yes, alrighty, that was amazing. I thank you so much. I hope we work together closely again in the future, maybe in person.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, you have anything going on in your little realm? I'm here. The Net Kids is here as well.
Yeah, so I got my new books, Bad Connections and Dumb Bullshit for Brilliant Idiots. They
Nice.
came out both last month. Horror Hangover is releasing some new episodes soon. I've got my Patreon where I do the horror anthology, what I'm calling Drop Dead Fiction, where I kind of do music, the writing, and the performance, all of one piece, like one piece of flash fiction. And this Friday, October 25th, I'll be at Haunt Happy Books in Lockhart, along with Lucas Mangum, Johnny Compton, Susan Snyder, Felix Morgan, and John Baltusberger. And that should be a great time. So if you're in the area, I have no idea where everyone else is looking. This is Lockhart, Texas, I'm talking about. So if you're near Austin, come out. It should be a blast. I love doing live events.
Awesome. There you have it. Alrighty, well, thank you everyone. Have a great night. That's it.